Jelle. It's great to have you here. Now, I want to dive into a fun fact straight away that I've already learned about you, which is your title from TNW. They describe you as the data whisperer and content Sherpa. Now, that might be slightly out of date, but tell me what was in your very, very early career. Where did you get started? And in a short story, tell me how you ended up in that role of data whisperer and content Sherpa for Index and of course the Next Web or TNW.
Right. So that's quite funny actually, because I applied for an internship at TNW, and then I went in for an interview, and our co-founder Patrick, in my second interview, said to me like, "Look, you're about to turn 27. You're applying for an internship. I can imagine you're not exactly clamoring to do work for an internship compensation. So, and you seem like a smart guy. So I'd like to offer you a traineeship. We'll give you some more responsibilities, and we can just kind of see how you like that. And if you fit into the company, then where." And at the time, we were just starting Index. So Index was an internal project at the time. It had maybe 1.5 developers working on it full time, and aside from that, it was just building out of Patrick's ideas. But there were a lot of interns and juniors being hired in the marketing department. So my traineeship officially started as content marketing for Index, and I just was finishing up my master's, which was extremely stats heavy. So I was doing a lot of stuff with data, and Index being at its core a data platform, I was trying to find ways to write content about the data that we were collecting through Index. And that's kind of how the content wizard and data Sherpa bit came about, because I was doing so much wrangling of just random data that we were collecting, trying to find stories in it.
Now that's super interesting, and naturally your master's lent a unique skill set there, being so stats heavy. What about I don't want to come back to Index in a moment. I'm really interested to learn a lot more about the work that you're doing there. But coming right back to the beginning of your career, I mean, talk to me about your very first moves in tech and some of the skills that you were picking up.
So my absolute first encounter in the professional world with tech was back when I was still living in Montreal, after I'd finished my bachelor's there, which was a Bachelor of Arts, had nothing to do with technology. And I got an internship at a small startup that was building a platform for NGOs to get funding. So funny enough, it wasn't all that different from Index. Index was conceived as a way to connect startups to sources of funding, and this platform was a way to connect NGOs to sources of funding. And fundamentally, the platforms were very similar. There were profiles about relevant organizations and how they fit into that space. And my job at the time was basically just filling in profiles. And so in the admin back office of this platform for things like the Gates Foundation and whatnot. So it involved doing a bit of research about their main focus for the programs that they're currently giving funding out for, and then writing profiles with Markdown because there hadn't been all that much work done on WYSIWYG editors for these profiles. So that was my absolute first encounter, and at the time I was working really closely with the people developing the platform. It was the startup had 3 FTEs at the time, I believe, and it got me really interested in learning to program and Python specifically, because they were building this platform in Python, and so it kind of sort of stopped there for a bit, and then I moved back to Amsterdam, started doing my master's, and during my master's, which was also not tech related but stats heavy, I started teaching myself Python And
Okay.
that,
And
yeah,
how was that? I mean, doing self-taught, I think, is such an interesting topic. How did you find that experience of teaching yourself the Python language?
so just before I got to that point, I had been doing some Code Academy courses, which I don't know if you remember or if you've ever seen them, but if you know what they were like 7, 8 years ago, they were much more basic than they are now. Um, and I'd been doing the ones for HTML and CSS, and that was fine, and it worked, but I felt like I wasn't coming away really understanding much. I felt like that I really just had learned some fun little knickknacks and, excuse me, but nothing really, let's say, applicable.
So let me then ask a question about that. So what do you think was missing at that learning experience?
Well, I've always been someone who learns best when I can see what I'm learning applied to a real world situation. So, in high school, mathematics really kind of became a thing I became extremely disinterested in because it became so abstract that I didn't really realize why I was doing what I was doing. And the problem with those Code Academy courses, again, I'm not going to say too many bad things about Code Academy now because I haven't done them in years. But back then was that you didn't quite end up with something that you built yourself. So I wanted to learn Python because I wanted to learn a real programming language and not just a scripting or a markup language. And I was much more interested in, the capabilities of Python to do things with data and to write actual applications. And so I downloaded the PDF of Learn Python the Hard Way, which to me sounded like, that sounds good. Like if you can do it the hard way, you can do it anyway, right? And I think what that course does really well, or what that book does really well, is really, really hammer the core concepts in the beginning, much like Code Academy, just making you sort of memorize what does what, but then very quickly makes you apply those contexts into building little programs. So you have little puzzles and assignments where you have to make a hangman game, or you have to find a way without using a pre-existing function in Python to sort a list alphabetically or something like that. And those are the things that really get you thinking and really kind of get you to see how a programming language actually does what it does and the logic behind an application. And just worked really well for me. Can't say
Yeah,
much
right.
more than that about it, I think.
Well, I think it's a really great combination from, the very structured master's program that you came back and did in Amsterdam, adding that self-taught Python experience, of course, brushing up a little on HTML and CSS at the same time. How did that sort of mixture of skills and learning and the roles that you had at the time, how did they bring you to your current role as head of product and development with Index and TNW? I want to get into that, but I want to know, what was it about all those previous experiences that really brought you to where you are now?
Well, so when I joined TNW, it was a very different company than it is now, obviously. Just in terms of the organization, there was a lot of experimentation going on of like, how do we expand beyond the conference and the media site to get into other things? And some of that was obviously Index. And the traineeship I did, it went well, but I felt very quickly that my heart wasn't necessarily so much in marketing as it was in helping the development team. I spent probably more of my time than I should have trying to sneak in learning about developing an actual production level application from the developers I was working with than writing content. I was doing that work too, but I was making sure to get as much knowledge from people as I could, and every now and then trying to get in and actually do some stuff on Index myself. And so slowly but surely, I was getting some experience with actual development outside of just writing code, you know, using your DevOps tools and setting up environments and making sure that your code works and testing your features and all that. And you know, at TNW, we've always been really open about having small projects going on that kind of, you know, they can benefit the company, but are like side projects that don't have a deadline and allow people to exercise learnings and engage in that way with their expertises. So I've used a lot of that time to develop. At one point, I started developing a lunch bot for Slack. We called it Lunchbot. It was a bot that let you put in your order for lunch, because when we first had TNW City, when we moved in there, we had a caterer, and they were always bringing far too much food because of the way their ordering system worked, and there was never enough vegan food for the vegans. There was never enough cheeseless food for the lactose intolerant people. So I built this little bot that let everyone put in their orders to order, and just kind of like made that ordering pipeline from us to the caterer much more efficient. And it meant that we it meant that we minimized our food waste a lot. And I found that really fun. And then eventually we expanded that to the entire TQ, at the time it was still called TQ community. And it actually started servicing the kitchen staff in TNW City. So all the companies enrolled in the lunch program at TNW City ordered through Lunchbot. The orders would be automatically, you know, exported for the lunch staff at the beginning of the week, so that the chef and his crew at the time could plan meals according to, you know, allergic allergies to certain ingredients, dietary preferences, and all of that.
Wow.
And
what a great example of, you know, a real product solving a real problem and just having that on the side without a deadline. I really like the way that you know, was made available to you to exercise, you know, as you said it, a little bit of free, well, not necessarily free time, but what I hear is creativity, right? Like having the space and autonomy within a role to be creative. And I think to a degree that's going to bring us now to Index. Super interested with what you're building there. Let me just ask you to introduce Index in a couple of sentences for those listening or watching who maybe haven't heard of it before.
Yeah, sure. So Index is a platform where we try to connect the startups in the tech space to corporates and investors and other startups in such a way that they can you know, use that to grow their business, either to get more exposure or to try to get funding from any of these parties, or partnerships with a larger corporate companies. It's just it was a way for us to put the various parts, disparate parts of the tech scene together online.
Yeah, it's really cool. And as I, you know, spent time looking at Index before having this chat with you, you know, I'm now understanding a lot more about your background. It's very data heavy. It's very searchable. It's really about making all of this information accessible. What was some of the, and maybe what are still some of the biggest challenges that you had to solve to bring Index to where it is today? And what are we looking forward to next from you and the team?
Well, I'll tell you that we used to have a saying in the development team at Index that if it wasn't for the need for a UI, Index would be perfect. So, and that was a bit glib of us to say, but the team was very very back-end oriented, and
right.
By nature of the platform, what we're actually sort of saying with that is that getting all the data in and parsing the data and processing it and putting it where it needs to be is one thing. Building a platform on top of that that's both extremely has extremely high utility but is also intuitive is extremely challenging. It's very, very challenging. As is any kind of platform, like UI, UX concerns are always a big challenge. But I would venture to say that it's almost harder when you're trying to provide something that's a real tool for servicing a need that you maybe don't know 100% what it is. Like, obviously, on one level, you're creating a platform for people to search and or collect this data, making it accessible, but you never really know what someone is specifically looking for. And building around that is just, it's extremely challenging. And when we really got into the weeds with trying to going from our initial version of Index to something that's that was much more modern, and B, much more focused on UI concerns of a user type that we'd already established was making use of the tool, it became a whole different ball game, to be honest.
Yeah, that's really fascinating, and I definitely appreciate how challenging the UX and UI side of it must be. I guess that's always a sort of like a tightrope that you need to walk, and bring the team, with you as you're building. But thankfully, you've got a ton of really interesting and very varied experience behind you, which brings me to really my ultimate question of this chat, which is knowing what you know now about the career and tech that you've had, the experiences that you've had. You've already mentioned a few things that have really resonated with me. The moment where you talked about being more excited about supporting and helping the developers around you rather than your marketing tasks, which you were sort of hired to do, to really just taking the opportunity to learn from them all the time. I really feel like learning has been such an important part of your career in the tech space. So knowing what you know now and learning what you've learned, what kind of advice would you give yourself if you were to go back to that very first moment when you're pursuing the entry into the tech environment?
To be honest, I think the most important thing that I would do differently is not let myself be scared off of learning to code by my past disinterest in things like mathematics and hard sciences. When I did my bachelor's, it was a multidisciplinary degree, and one of the tracks of that degree, it was in international development, and one of the tracks was rather stats heavy, on the social science side, and I avoided it like the plague. When I did my master's, I couldn't avoid doing the stats parts. It was basically an applied statistics course, that was essentially what it came down to. And I realized that I actually, one, found it really interesting, and two, had a knack for it. So I think what I would go back and do is, maybe either have taken the time during my bachelor's to just branch out and take a few computer science courses just to get that foundation a little more solid. And otherwise, maybe just have taken, there's a lot surrounding why I made the decisions in my career that I did, but maybe earlier on, I would have just taken a decision and be like, you know what, I got to here and I really like this development thing. I'm just going to pursue it for a little while. Just take the plunge. It never seems like there's enough time to learn or to catch up or to get enough experience to be good enough for something. But there is a lot of time. If I look back at everything I've learned while doing the job I've been doing, I could, if I had been developing full time, I could have learned so much on top of that.
Really interesting. So a real focus for you could be, in this theoretical going back in time, is really just putting the head down a bit more into the practical examples. But that being said, when you did talk about this earlier, you did mention, well, hey, Code Academy isn't what it is now. You know, it wasn't what it is now. So perhaps there were some challenges for you there, but I still appreciate that all the same. I'd like to ask one follow-up, which is, yeah, we've talked a little bit about sort of that technical thing and how that could have been more helpful perhaps if you were to embrace it more. I'd like to ask you now about on the non-technical side of things, thinking of, you know, reflecting on your career, the teams that you've worked in, the projects that you've worked on with groups of people. What advice would you give yourself about working in tech with other people?
That's a really interesting question. I've always seen myself as a pretty good people person. And I think that throughout my career at TNW, especially, I've made a point of trying to, you know, learn from and get on with everybody, because everybody has their own expertise and their own part to share. You know, a company is many people, and everyone has something to contribute, and you can legitimately learn something from everyone. So yeah, I don't know if I have a good answer to this.
I think that was a great answer, actually. Just simply acknowledging that, hey, that is something that you can learn from everybody who you will come across professionally. It may not be evident straight away. Perhaps it takes a little bit of digging or a little bit of patience for you to figure out what that might be. But I think that's a really fantastic answer, Jelle. Thank you so much for this time. I've certainly learned a lot from you and appreciated this. Is there anything else you'd like to share with anyone watching or listening about Index, TNW, or anything else before we say goodbye?
No, not specifically. I mean, come to the conference. You know, it's on every year. It's always good fun. It's really great content, and you know, our editorial staff is doing their best year round to write great content about tech. Also about development. We have some dedicated channels to that, and so just check out TNW.
Yeah, awesome. I have to underscore that. The next web conference, I remember moving to Amsterdam, seeing it set up in Vesta Park and thinking, oh my goodness, what is this crazy music festival that I'm missing out on? It turns out it was the next web, and I've been so excited to attend every year. Of course, last year in 2020, it wasn't a physical event. This year, we're seeing it return with a hybrid. I'm going to be there. I'm looking forward to seeing you there as well. Jelle van Wijhe, thank you so much for your time today. I will see you at the conference.
Thank you.